Hi, everyone. Welcome to the DeSci Labs community call for January 9th, 2023. In today's community call, we're going to be giving a follow-up on the Marcus Mufano Future of Science seminar. So for anyone who was there, it was a great conversation on reproducibility, replicability, and developing a theory of change for academic science. And if you weren't able to make it this time around, you can find the YouTube links later on this week at dscifoundation.org/seminar. So that's going to be the main point of conversation. But in the meantime, why don't we go ahead and give a couple quick updates on everything that's happening with DeSci Labs. Chris, do you have anything that you want to talk about with respect to nodes development? Chris, if you're talking, we are not able to hear you.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm listening today.
Okay, fair enough. Um, do you want to give a quick announcement on the open beta?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we're working hard on shipping this open beta. It's going to have a couple of features like having the ability to connect code, data, and all sorts of different artifacts together into a research object that will be accompanied with metadata, PIDs, and all of the other components that essentially enable fair data, fair digital objects. And that beta will be available in a couple of weeks, as we are currently in the last sprint to deliver all the different components that we need to make this a reality.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. And as we have additional updates on this open beta, we'll make sure to announce them on the Discord. Carla, would you like to give just a quick update on the Node Stewards program?
Yeah, sure. I mean, not much happened since the last call, since I think everybody took a little break between Christmas and New Year's. But exciting news: we are starting to build our very first steward-generated node out of a really cool piece of research in computer science. So that's the goal for this month, essentially. And then we're also trying to onboard a couple new stewards. So if you are not part of the program, but you're interested in exploring the world of cool open science and turning that into DeSci nodes, let me know. Join the program. We would be super happy to have you.
Awesome. Thank you. Then just a couple quick conference updates. We are going to be at DeSci London from January 13th to January 16th. I believe we have a speaking spot there, but if you want to come and talk to DeSci Labs folks and are going to be at the London conference, feel free to come look for us. I believe Chris and Philip will both be there. We're going to be participating in the World Economic Forum between January 16th and January 20th. So if you want to learn more about fair data and open science, that would be a great place to go. And then finally, we are helping to organize a lot of the work that's going around DeSci Denver. So if you're interested in coming to a more collaborative conference session in the US, feel free to reach out and ask questions. DeSci Denver is going to be great. And there's a DeSci-centric co-working house that will be going on between the 24th and the 24th of February and the 5th of March. So plenty of different opportunities to both get involved in the Discord community and to come be a part of things in person. And with that, I think we're pretty much good on updates for the day. So does someone want to just quickly kick us off on discussion around the Future of Science seminar?
Yeah, I mean, I can do a quick recap if you like, and then we can hear what everybody has to say. So this week we had Marcus Munafo, and he's part of the steering group of the UK Reproducibility Network, which is this really cool initiative that started in the UK with basically the goal to bring open science forward and to make the adoption of open science practices much more widespread than it commonly is. In order to increase the quality of science that's being put out there. And I think one of his first points, which I thought was really striking, was that we need to focus on the quality of science, but not the output of science. but the process of science. So we need to put more focus on how do we actually conduct our studies, how do we build our experiments, how do we analyze our data. So basically have these quality checkpoints at every point in the process of creating science, which will then, of course, lead to higher quality outcomes, but also, according to what he's saying, and leads to more productivity because you don't have to fix any mistakes in the long run by going back to your science. And also you can more comfortably build on science that's already being put out there because you can trust in the process and you have some evidence of, oh, this research was conducted in a trustworthy way and they chose the right methods and all that stuff. So that was really interesting. And then he also basically presented his theory of change for academic science and kind of what it should look like or how he's constructing it. Because as I'm aware, they don't have a fully formalized vision for that theory of change. But he had 5 points on where science and the whole ecosystem must change in order to make open science more of a thing within science. So the ground layer is infrastructure. So we need infrastructure to make open science possible. Then we need user interfaces and experiences to make it easy to do open science. Then we need change on the community level in order to make it normative to have open research practices. And on top of that, we need incentives to make it actually rewarding to conduct open science. And I think this is probably where we have a lot of problems right now, even though all the other layers are problematic as well. And then the top layer, and that's actually a point maybe where we can jump into discussion because I'm having some question marks. The top layer is policy, and it's about making it required to do open science. And yeah, I don't know, maybe from my perspective, I'm just feeling like if we have open science, open research practices, reproducibility fully ingrained on the infrastructure, user experience, community, and incentive level, so it is possible, easy, normative, and rewarding to do open science. Do we need policy? Do we need to make it required? I don't know, because I feel like maybe making it required makes it less attractive or can have some other negative consequences. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Carla. So generally, you need a policy when the incentives aren't aligned in the right way. That's, every mandate that's issued is there to fix an incentive problem. But every time you mandate something, you often create resentment from people that are subject to this mandate because it's not seen as something that's rewarding, something that's seen as additional bureaucracy. So it's difficult. So I always like to think, mandate less, celebrate more is a good way to think about, how we could change culture. I think it's important to celebrate people that do the right thing and to give them incentives to do those right things. And in essence, if we had a system that had aligned incentives, we wouldn't need to mandate because the emergent behavior of the system would essentially align with these incentives that naturally promote open science. Of course, the question is whether or not there exists a set of incentives and measurable outcomes which, by their sheer force, will align the incentives in a way that open science becomes a social norm. I guess that's an open question. And if the answer to this is no, which I think is unlikely, then you need mandates. You might need mandates. There's a moral case for having mandates. But I think it's very hard. It's a very hard argumentation to hold. So yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you. I think the last thing researchers generally want to hear, and I think this has to also do with the excessive bureaucracy of the system, right? So there's already so many mandates and reporting requirements and grant follow-ups and committee meetings and all sorts of bureaucratic activity that if you add more to it, it just creates more frustration. So there's fatigue.
Yeah, I mean,
But yeah.
another part of it is the people who are creating regulation likely don't fully understand the system that's being regulated and the intricacies within. You can bring in experts to help advise and to help guide, but there's always going to be something that's lost in translation. So, to a certain extent, regulation will never be perfect in the way that possibly, I mean, it's a big if true kind of statement, but possibly incentive structures could be.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's gonna be about funding and growing your reputation, growing your lab, growing your group, and having more opportunities to spend these resources to make more additional discoveries that will satisfy your deep curiosity for understanding the world. I think these are the types of incentives that scientists respond very strongly to. And if we can create systems that essentially reward behaviors that in a way that is conducive to these goals, while at the same time producing open science, then you don't need a mandate. But I mean, it's a easy thing to say. It's a very hard thing to do in practice.
Yeah, I think one thing that the UKRN accomplished was changing the hiring and promotion criteria for some universities. So I think the status quo right now in many universities is if you want to get promoted, you need to have published in journal A, B, and C. At least that's what I heard from some researchers that I've spoken to. And the UKRN was able to change that in, I think, University of Bristol, maybe others as well, where the promotion criteria now include having to have some open research practices within your work. So your work needs to be open science, essentially, in order to get promoted. And I think that's really powerful because actually these promotion criteria of having to publish in these specific places is actually a very, very powerful mechanism, keeping scientists in the old way of doing science and like restraining them from experimenting with new formats of publishing and doing their science. And if networks like these are able to change universities' minds about that, I think that's very, very powerful. So I'm hoping we'll see more universities change their promotion criteria in the future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, these are extremely powerful levers. The question then, of course, that these things open up is like, well, how can it be gamed, right? So we have to be careful every time we introduce changes in incentives, because there's the moment you introduce a new metric, well, the thing it's supposed to measure ceases to be the target, and you're just optimizing for the metric. So the question is like, well, how do you define open science practices?
Yeah, I mean, you have a good point there, but I wonder, like, okay, so say I have a university, and if I promote anybody, they have to, like, 50% of their publications have to have data and code available. Wouldn't that be a good metric?
I don't know. It's not such a good metric for qualitative anthropologists, right?
Right.
So it's this is the difficult part, is the one size fits all, and every bureaucracy wants to have one size fits all, because you can't really have nuance in systems that provide measurements that need to apply to all. And this is why we still rely so much on PDFs and still do vanilla citation tracking, because these things will apply across every single discipline of science, right? It's the lowest common denominator of something we can agree on. So these things are tricky to implement. I do think that in the empirical sciences, right, we can take a subset of all science and say, for example, if you're operating in the empirical sciences, having had pre-registered studies, pre-registered analysis plan is something that hiring committees should highly value, and that is absolutely true. So I'm very much convinced that this would be the type of practices that would improve the quality of the scientific record. Because as we know, and this has been demonstrated times and times again, pre-registered report, pre-registered analysis plan these tend to drastically reduce the number of researcher degrees of freedom, ability to engage in questionable research practices, and in general, trickle all the way down to creating more reproducible and replicable research, right? Which is, I think, the standard we really want to go to. Now, in addition to that, having things like having made data available to your community that has been reused to produce additional insights and new knowledge, I think is also extremely valuable. Because there's an innate tendency, and it's absolutely understandable, that if you've collected data or have special access to data, well, you want to keep it for you, because you have the incentive to essentially milk that data till the last drop and get as many papers out from that data as you possibly can. And very often what happens is that at the end of the day, the data ends up on a drive somewhere in your old university that you've long since left, and you actually never got.
Chris, I don't hear you anymore. I don't know if that's only me.
Oh,
I do. I hear you, Chris.
okay. Yeah, so having data sharing and recognizing that putting data available out in the open and making it fair and making it reusable by others and having that data generate additional discoveries is something that should be celebrated, because it shows like this pro-social tendencies. Like, hey, we've collected this very interesting data. It was expensive to collect. It took a lot of time and resources from my laboratory and from my consortium and from all these people we've been working with, but we're making it available because we don't want to monopolize the entirety of the discoveries that can be made with it. I think that's extremely valuable, because that tends to not only accelerate research dramatically, but also puts more eyes on target, right? So like you're more likely, people, the larger the communities working with data, forming around data, generally that also will tend to produce more reproducible and replicable work. There's just more eyes on target. It's the same thing with open source code. And yeah, speaking of open source code, that's also something today that isn't celebrated to its rightful extent. If you're a scientist and you produce toolboxes, software toolboxes for other scientists, well, good luck having that, recognized by funders and funded. It's very difficult to produce software pipelines and having those funded and essentially building these invaluable tools that researchers use on a daily basis. It's very tricky and very difficult and very time consuming. And these artifacts are not recognized to their merit. So, having also a track record of putting code available, making your work reproducible, producing tools and toolboxes and pipelines for others to reuse, and having a demonstrable case that these tools are of sufficient quality that they've brought value in your community, meaning that they've been reused and they've been put to use to produce new knowledge, is also something that would be extremely valuable. So essentially, there's this underlying thread beneath all of this, right? It's like a tendency to essentially put out, pro-social in a pro-social way, valuable artifacts that other scientific communities can reuse. It's a tendency to make your work more reproducible because you follow these best practices. And these best practices definitely need to be recognized by hiring community, grant agencies, philanthropic organizations, and funders of science in general. And these are some of the most powerful levers that we can imagine to change practices and norms.
I completely agree. And to a certain extent, a lot of this goes back to one of Marcus's original points, which was focusing on the process instead of the output itself. One of the things that's been, I think, ties in very well to this is the natural rate of non-replication, where, to one of your earlier points, Chris, if you're in qualitative anthropology, the idea that you have code and data shared may not necessarily track across what quality open science should look like in your field. Because if you're taking a specific study at a point in time in a very specific geography, it's going to be very difficult for someone to replicate that. But the idea that there has been a process where you've put in a pre-registered analysis plan, you've followed it. Maybe there's a large group of people who have been looking at your research, who have been reusing your code, who have been reusing your data. Then it's no longer about then judging someone based on the quality of that process during the research itself can be, I guess, kind of an abstraction and an interim metric for the quality of research. Another thing about focusing on process instead of outputs is that you can get a better view into research at its onset instead of just looking at citation counts 10 years down the road, because ultimately a paper is not going to like complete its life cycle of citations for the better part of a decade. So as a funder trying to figure out what research that you want to fund in this current system, you're kind of guessing in the dark based
Yeah.
on what seems valuable and the hope that that will get citations later on. Some of these metrics are very
You're really delegating to editorial committees and journals, right? So you're delegating to editorial committees, meaning that you look at the type of journals that the researcher has been publishing in, and you look at their impact factor, you look at their standing within their communities, and you use those as proxy to evaluate the productivities of the scholars that you're putatively interested in funding. And you do this exactly because these citations have not been able to run their full life cycle, right? So you need these earlier proxies, and these proxies are problematic for many reasons that we've talked about. In other fields, they have slightly different practices. It's all quite interesting, to look at the heterogeneity there. So in some fields are extremely rigorous and strict and put quotas, like on papers you need to publish. For example, in economics, it's quite well known. You need to have at least one paper in the top four. To have there's like tenure committees have very strict lists of how many papers you need to publish and which journal tiers. And if you don't meet those criteria after that period of being an assistant professor in a U.S. university, well, then it's likely you're not going to get tenure. So different fields operate in different ways. And it's important to recognize that. And then again, the question is like, how do you essentially reconcile this tension between open science practices, the extra work that goes into it, and the current incentives of researchers?
One thing that was interesting from the conversation with respect to that was journals being responsible for both dissemination and verification. And the fact that that probably shouldn't necessarily be a thing. Journals are wonderful at dissemination of scientific research, but peer review just in and of itself is not a powerful enough mechanism for quality control to have any kind of an impact. So I guess, Chris, what are your thoughts on kind of splitting the two of those up as a standard for open science?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of unbundling generally. So journals nowadays, they do so much things. It's becoming absolutely ridiculous, right? The amount of tech overhead you have to run a journal without a publisher is just completely insane. Like, you need to have so many checks and so much tech built into your platform in order to be able to conduct what is expected out of a journal. So, you need plagiarism check. That's a SaaS product. You need, image manipulation verification. That's another SaaS product. You need indexing on Web of Science and Scopus. Well, that's a lot of like applications and compliance you have to run. You need to have databases with your manuscripts in JAST XML format so that they can be readable on mobile and all of these things, right? You also need to have PDF versions. Then you need PIDs, you need DOIs. Then you need to make sure that you have like a manuscript tracking system. So that's another SaaS product you have to subscribe to. And then you need a journal management system. Well, here we go, another one. And at the end of the day, once you're done, having this entire massive backend of technology and services that you're outsourcing or SaaS products that you pay for, well, you end up, having something that's very complicated on your hand, right? And that's not typically what a publisher wants to do. I think a lot of publishers or journals, they just don't see themselves as like, hey, I'm going to be a tech company. No, They want to be curators. They want to help their communities. They want to create legitimacy for these scientific communities, for these nascent fields, so that this legitimacy will then translate in funding and respect for these nascent fields, right? And they want to do this by fostering communities, by having quality editorial boards, by having network of qualified, competent, and willing peer reviewers to provide valuable feedback that they can trust. That's what they're good at. And the fact that they need to become tech companies on the side or subscribe to an enormous mass of SaaS services in order just to run their day-to-day business operations is pretty crazy to me.
I mean, ultimately, that is not and should not be the job of a scientific society. If I'm publishing a paper in a specific field, I would hope that that scientific society can help me point out flaws, can help me bring that paper to others in the society itself. It feels like an overstep at times to put the entirety of scientific validation on people whose focus is on a specific field of science. The idea that they're doing plagiarism checks, that they're doing image manipulation checks, it just feels out of scope. And as we move further and further into science in the digital world, those requirements are just going to continue growing. Like we're probably going to see GPT-3 checks in the near.
Exactly. So that's the next SaaS service you have to subscribe to as a society publisher is the Zero GPT SaaS service to verify that the articles haven't been written by AI in an undisclosed way. So there you go. That's another service. So that's the real challenge, right? There's a tremendous amount of tech that these journals need to put in place, and yeah, the idea of unbundling all of this, I think, makes tremendous amount of sense. They're all important. That's the other thing. All of these things are important. And if you ignore some of these, well, you can have a scandal. And this is something that these systems are extremely averse to, right? Nobody likes to have, see, oh, damn it, this paper I published in my journal, me being the editor-in-chief, is actually plagiarized. Oh, damn. I mean, that is really, really tarnishing for your reputation, right? So you're risk averse in general. You have to be risk averse because, there's this asymmetry about risk rewards with scandals, and you have to be extremely sensitive to that. Because you're a trusted intermediary in the information space, and I think that's really the key to understand. Is that publishers are platform providers for scientific communities that operate as journals that create legitimacy for nascent field that then allow funding and legitimacy gains in the academic and research world, right? So that's what essentially happens, and because of all of these technology requirements and the fact that journal operators just don't want to deal with it. That's why you have so much consolidation in the industry. That's why, Elsevier controls, 2,600 titles, because it didn't start this way. It's just been that over time, these societies, these scientific communities, they just throw the towel. They're done. They don't want to handle with all of the complex IT. They're not even sustainable financially, and they struggle. So big companies can move in, buy them up, and they know how to generate revenue out of these systems, right? We've had for two decades now, or a decade and a half, like the bundle deal with libraries, which was extremely profitable for publishers. Now we have gold open access with high APCs and cascading journals. That's what's going to be taking over. And you can't do this if you don't have tremendous economy of scales in your systems, and that's why it's such a this is the case that small publishers and small learned societies, they struggle so much with their publishing. And that's why, companies like Elsevier can have a profit margin of 40% because of the sheer power of these economy of scales, bundle deals, and cascading OA deals that they can do. And that's a big problem. So the other question, I guess, is like, how do you level the playing field? How do you make, small society publishers able to compete in that sphere? Well, you need to provide them, different types of tools and platforms, and completely and radically open system for them to be able to flourish in. I think that's going to be a major challenge because ultimately, all of this is labor intensive, right? It may or may not cost money because some people will do it for free, and you have such a thing as Platinum open access, which is free for authors and free for readers. But it's still a tremendous amount of man hours. I mean, just the fact that the scientific community does peer review as a community service, I mean, that's, you had estimates. It's like, 5 billion a year of hours spent doing peer review. Sure, we do it for free, but nonetheless, there's a time cost to it. And we have to be mindful of those time costs, and we have to recognize those time costs, and we have to think about ways in which we can not only improve the efficiency of the system, reduce the burden of IT maintenance on publishers, and especially small publishers, because that's another thing you hear all the time, right? It's like, oh, everything's digital, it should be free. Everything should be free. Well, digital is extremely expensive for publishers, small publishers. For big publishers, they have tremendous economy of scales and they figured it out. But for small publishers, there are publishers out there that are afraid to put a single line of JavaScript on the front end for fear that it's going to break everything. They're just terrified. The IT is not something they like to do. It's not their core competence center. I mean, if they could return to publishing books, they would. Like this digital revolution, I think this year, like the Society for Publishing, I forgot the name exactly, had finally a survey, and it showed the majority of publishers, finally, digital has crossed 60% approval amongst publishers, right? It took 30 years. And a lot of them would, prefer going back to printing books. So there's also a deep transformation, deep systemic transformation, which is to some degree alienating to publishers, especially small publishers. It's just, transforming the business so deeply and in ways that moves outside of their core competency centers that it's jarring. And as a result, digital is expensive. I mean, look at a journal like PLOS, right? PLOS is a mega journal. When PLOS was started, publishers were saying, it's never going to work, it's never going to work. It turned out, Alison Mudded, the CEO of PLOS, she made it sustainable. So she made, PLOS a sustainable journal. So it's recouping its cost in APCs. But still, to get a paper passed by PLOS, you're gonna pay, $2,000. Well, that's the cost of sustainability. The question is like, are they levers, technological levers that would allow us to make the cost of digital much lower? And the answer to this is obviously yes. The question is like, how? And I think that's a really big question. And then even if you figure out the how, is like, well, how do you engineer, the conditions in which you can create adoption for these systems?
So, Chris, from the 5 levels that Marcus talked about of the theory of change for academic science, the lowest being infrastructure, then building on top of that would be user interface, community, incentives, and policy. Where do you think the most impact can be made at this moment?
I think the most impact is always policy, right? So like if you like something like the OSTP memo, it's just an earthquake. It's like, now we mandate that everyone must do X and you have no choice, otherwise your funding is cut. I mean, that changes behavior immediately. There's no doubt. The thing is, it's like taking a giant sledgehammer, right? And trying to do microsurgery. So it's a cudgel, and it can backfire, but it definitely changes things, right? Question is like, well, does it create sustainable quality changes, that improves the system without unforeseen second and third order consequences that actually contribute to making things worse? Well, that's the open question, right? I think a lot of open access, I mean, a lot of publishers think of open access this way, right? It's like, okay, well, now scientists are our clients because everything needs to be open access, so scientists need to pay. Well, what does that do? Well, all of a sudden it creates this gigantic incentives for predatory journals, paper mills, because they're essentially saying, hey, you pay us, we turn you into a data point that your funder will consider, and we do this at minimal effort for you. And actually, you can publish just about anything. You just need to pay us, and we'll index it, and we'll make it something you can put on your CV. That's a corruption of the original intent of scientific curation. It's a total corruption, and these are the side effects and incentives that happen when you have good ideas like open access, right? So it's very important to be mindful about these things. And yeah, so that's why policy is the most powerful. It's also the most dangerous. It's a cudgel. We have to be careful about it. It has unforeseen second and third order effects. I think the one that creates the most positive changes, has the potential to create most positive changes, is platforms and interfaces that naturally create incentives, but it's very hard to do. I think that's really hard to do, but it has tremendous potential. I think at the end of the day, the problem here is that you need all of those levers to be activated simultaneously in some form of way, and that's how they all compound off each other.
I mean,
And
it goes back
you
to
can't just activate one in a vacuum.
that is, I think that was another one of Marcus's points throughout the whole call was you have to do all of this together. Scientists themselves don't necessarily have the leverage needed to make meaningful impacts on open access. The incentives are built against them. Culture can be built against them. The infrastructure is not built for the digital world. So
Yeah,
it's
open access, open science. You mean open science, right?
yeah,
Open access
open
is more or
science.
less
I
a
apologize.
solved issue. You know, no, open science is very much the sticky point here. This is a challenge, and I think you need. I mean, in the ideal world, you have all of these levels that are simultaneously and carefully pressed, right? And carefully is very important here because the old. You have to be mindful about what you want to replace the old with. I think it's very easy to say, well, it's all bad. It's easy to make something better. I think that's incredibly naive because the deeper you go into these systems, right, this vast, because let's face it, I mean, scientists, they're in a world where they are facing a vast scientometric machinery, right, that turns their research outputs into data points on a dashboard. And it does this, right? It's this inexorable system that people know as publish or perish, right? But at the end, it's the brainchild of Eugene Garfield, who was this famed American sociologist who created citation tracking and impact factor and all of these things that led to the web of science and all of these big innovations that were there to justify funding that Congress was pouring into science. Same with peer review. Peer review is also a bureaucratic justification system to say that money isn't wasted, right? I mean, it also does quality control and all of these things, but it is really as a system justification for spending vast amounts of taxpayer money into that system. And of course, there's always competition for budget and taxpayer money. Everyone wants more of it. So how do you fight for it as a funder? Well, you have to say, well, look at the impact that I've generated with those billions of dollars you've allocated to me. And by the way, all of this has been peer reviewed. We use citation tracking, we quantitatively measure impact, and we have a grasp on how much we have changed society for the better. If you can't prove that, if you can't show that, your budget is getting cut. And that's the reality. And so I think you really have to understand that these things haven't emerged in a vacuum. They're the fruits of decades of small incremental changes that have happened over the last you could even say 60, 70 years in which the system has been radically changed. I was reading before going to DeSci London, reading this the original discovery of the structure of DNA paper. It was published in Nature. It's about this faint structure of DNA. And I was reading, and I was like, wow, the language is playful. This is actually so pleasant to read. It was so nice, such a good read. And if you look at papers that were written, or like Shannon's information theory, or like there's a bunch of like these old school papers that were written, they're just absolutely fantastic reads. And the language is playful. It has soul into it, right? And now the one of the more perverse effects of peer review is that it has policed language, right? So scientists, when they write a paper, they always think, oh, okay, I can't talk like this. I have to be very, very careful with my words. I have to, walk on eggs, else the peer reviewer is going to be displeased with me and my paper is going to get rejected. And I have to kind of adopt this very strict and normative scientific English standard, right? Which is very challenging to write and equally challenging to read. And yeah, so these are some of the conformist pressure that peer reviewed has created in the system. It's very interesting when you think about it from the history of science.
Actually, I'm kind of curious to read some of these old papers now. I cannot imagine an academic paper with playful language. That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, that was the norm actually. Before the Cold War, or actually, I mean, hard to say if it was the norm. This new paper that came out recently showing the drop in disruptive science had a comparison of words being used, right? And I think I haven't read it very deeply, but essentially the argument is like, hey, science is less disruptive. Look at the words being used, right? They look at other things like new citation indexes and measures and things like that. But they also look at words and they say, look, the words are indicative of less playful language. I mean, not less playful language, but they say the words are indicative of less radical innovation. And it's interesting because when you look at them, yeah, you're like, okay, so it used to be very active words, and now we're at very passive words, right? Very careful words. And when you think about it, it's well, you could say, well, okay, what it is representing is the fact that scientists just can't come up with like bangers anymore, right? For whatever reason in the system. Well, the other alternative to say is like, well, there's a conformist pressure on writing style that is causing this drift in the use of words. It's also, an interesting case. And of course, there's also the case to be made that, well, perhaps that's for the best, And I think it's all, again, we have to be careful, when we criticize or we look at these systems.
Another interesting angle with respect to that, and it kind of ties back into peer review, was something that I think was published on the Discord maybe a month ago. It was a paper around peer review actually leading towards conformity. I don't think it was an actual scientific paper. I think it was more of an opinion piece, but it basically stated that peer review can be used and often is used as a political tool to push people back towards a central norm instead of allowing for verifiable but new and innovative concepts to come out.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a great essay. I really loved it. There's another one I really liked. You can just read it out loud. So essentially, it was how did this go about? It was so Leo Szilard who first conceived of the Manhattan Project. He wrote a short story called The Mark Gabel Foundation. In this fictional piece, the protagonist, Mark Gabel, believes that science is causing too much change too fast and he wants to slow it down. He's willing to spend money to do so. His advisors in the story think there is a simple way to proceed, one that will look supportive while it also will slow and stymie science. So he goes, I think it shouldn't be very difficult. As a matter of fact, I think it would be quite easy. You could set up a foundation with an annual endowment of $30 million. Research workers in need of funds could apply for grants if they could make out a convincing case. Have 10 committees, each composed of 12 scientists appointed to pass on these applications. Take the most active scientists out of the lab and make them members of these committees. And the very best men in the field should be appointed as chairman at salaries of $50,000 each. Also have about 20 prizes of $100,000 each. This is just about all you would need to do. Your lawyers could easily prepare a charter for the foundation. The best scientists would be removed from their labs and kept busy in committees, passing out on application for funds. The scientific worker in need of fund would concentrate on problems which were considered promising and pretty certain to lead to publishable results. For a few years, there might be great increase in scientific output. But by going after the obvious, pretty soon science would dry out. Science would become something like a parlor game. Some things would be considered interesting, others not. There would be fashions. Those who followed the fashion would get grants, those who would not, and pretty soon they would learn to follow the fashion too. It's a pretty cool short story. Interestingly,
So much.
this is in 1948, right? This is before the universal rise of peer review, before NIH, before all of these vast centralized funding bodies, right? It's really striking to see.
God, that is so terrible. This man just predicted the future. That's beautiful.
Yeah, this was the time like that man, like the scientists back then, they were like just so brilliant. It was like it's just yeah. I mean, they a lot of them foresaw the future, and were also this was a time of like radical innovation and acceleration and knowledge on every side. We made times of tremendous progress.
Well, here's to hoping that one day we can get back to that. Baby
Yeah, the
step.
question is how, right? I mean, we have there's five pillars, and these pillars need to be pressed in the correct order, simultaneously, slowly, gently, with wisdom, under the guidance of meta science and yeah, it's a, I mean, it's a fascinating problem space. It's probably like the most pressing problem that is humanity is facing, is like, hey, our engine of knowledge creation has been decelerating for decades. How do we put it back in track so that we can all have nice things?
It's funny that you say that. I was actually writing up a talk I'm going to be giving at a conference on why the replication crisis is the most pressing crisis facing humanity. If we want to go about solving climate change, we need science firing on all cylinders, quite frankly, because our best option towards solving the climate crisis is giving more money to scientists who focus on solving climate issues. Yes, this is 100% the most serious issue facing humanity today.
Yep. Yeah, our engine of progress and the creation of a robust, replicable, and innovative scientific record. Definitely.
Baby steps. Well, I see where we're coming towards the end of the call. I think we have time for maybe one more question or comment. If anybody else has something that they'd like to add. Okay. Well, if that's the case, then I think we're pretty much good on the community call today. As always, thank you guys for joining. Please feel free to reach out to Carla if you want to join the Node Stewards program. Come meet us in DeSci London, sign up for the next Future of Science seminars, and I look forward to seeing everyone here next week. And with
Thank you,
that,
everyone.
we'll start Coffee House.